Welcome back to Leveraging Leadership, where we unpack the art of business leadership. I'm your host, Emily Sander, Chief of Staff turned Executive Leadership Coach. This show is all about finding your points of greatest influence and leveraging them to better serve those around you. And today's guest is Urs Koenig. Did I say your name right?
You did.
Excellent. I practiced that. But Urs, welcome to Leveraging Leadership. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation, Emily.
Looking forward to it as well. So, just for the listener, Urs has been a UN military peacekeeper, NATO commander, ultra endurance champion, professor, and executive coach, and he now keynotes and delivers practical tools and actionable insights, which I love, to business leaders. And he has recently become a best-selling author with his book Radical Humility, which I have read and love. So thank you so much for writing it. We will deep dive into the book here in this episode, and I should read the full title because it's cool. Radical Humility, Be a Badass Leader and a Good Human. So I said, yes, that's definitely something that I would like to learn more about. So I love picking up the book, but Urs and I met at a National Speakers Association event. It's got to be several months ago now. So we met there, and even though you had not told me you had a military background, I would have guessed that given your bearing and just how you were walking around. I'm like, this man has been in the military. And last time we spoke, you had been tapped to give a keynote to the UN. So I was wondering, has that happened yet, or is that still in the works?
No, that's still in the works
Still in the
actually.
works.
That's gonna happen in January. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so you're just on a rocket ship. We were just talking. Your book was promoted in Times Square and all the billboards in New York. So you've got a good thing going here. So just to start us off, we'll dive into your book here. And for the listener to keep in mind, can you just give a lens or a general approach to keep in mind as we deep dive into some of the practical applications here?
Absolutely. So maybe it's helpful, Emily, if I sort of briefly define what I mean by leading with radical humility. So it's a three-legged stool. So the first leg is deep self-awareness. And that's what people often think of when they think of humility. Like I see myself accurately in line with how others see us. So that's deep self-awareness. We can dive deep into, there's a portion there which also talks about having focus, having the humility to know that I can't do everything, but I can do almost anything I put my mind to. So that's the first one, deep self-awareness, deep self-knowledge. The second leg of the stool is leading relationally. And so rather than just my content expertise, building meaningful and trusting relationships with my team members and all the people I work with or for. So that's leading relationally, one-on-one. And then the third leg of the stool is leading relationally on an organizational level. And they're leaning on Amy Edmondson's work of psychological safety, building a psychologically safe culture. So that's the third leg of the stool. And undergirding the three legs is the famous growth mindset, right? So seeing mistakes and setbacks as an opportunity for learning and growing versus something to be ashamed of, or, worse, even sweep under the carpet. So that's sort of radical humility in a nutshell.
Beautiful. And one of the things I like about your book is it's very practical. So it's introducing concepts, but it's not staying in the high lofty buzzword. It's like, and here's some examples of what that means. One of the sections that I loved and caught my eye was the part where you talked about being tough on results and having high standards, but being tender on people. And I thought that's so good, but a lot of people might hear that and go, okay, well, that sounds nice, but how do you actually do that in the real world? So do you have a practical example of being tough on results, but tender on people?
Absolutely. So I will give you a practical one, but just let's first sort of look at what that means. It means holding my people to the highest standards while having meaningful and trusting relationships with them. The notion that we either have to be a tough leader or a nice person is a false dichotomy. So, how can this look? So I have an example in the book where the best commander I ever had, and he was my commander in Kosovo, he opened a meeting in his office with these words. He literally said, Urs, I love you, you know I do, and this is not even close to being good enough. So, his words made me shrink in my chair and then made me turn myself inside out for the next 9 months to deliver the very best work I could. The point is, if he would have yelled at me, if he would have belittled me, I would have tuned him out. But I knew, and obviously we've built a strong relationship for the last 6 months. I knew he cared for me. He wanted to help me in my own career. He truly got me. We had a meaningful and trusting relationship. That's why I was able to hear his feedback, his tough feedback. So that's one example. The former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, had sort of too many leadership principles, but two stand out. He said leadership sometimes means pissing people off. So that's the top end results. I often joke with my clients, if you're annoying everybody a little bit, that's probably a good sign that you're doing a good job. But Powell also said the day your soldiers stop bringing you their problems is the day you stop leading them, because they concluded that you either don't care or you can't help them. Both are a failure in leadership. So that's the tender on people part. So these are just two practical examples. And, I can talk some more about how I suggest that we all go about deepening relationships at work. What often I want to emphasize is it doesn't mean that I need to bare my soul open. It doesn't mean I need to tell everybody my darkest secret. It does not mean that at all. We can have different levels of relationships, different depth of relationships with different people in our team. Some people, we might just talk, about our weekend plans, what we did over the weekend. And with others, they're comfortable immediately going very deep. And so we can have different levels of relationships with different people on our team without being a phony.
Well, that leads me into another part of your book, which is leading relationally. And a lot of chiefs of staff are listening to this. And one of the biggest comments I get from them is, Emily, I can't go in that room. I can't be of influence. I can't make an impact because I don't know as much as these people. I'm not as technically proficient. I'm like, look, like the fact that you don't know a lot can be a huge advantage because a lot of times subject matter experts know too much and they can't communicate that out or translate that to other people. So that's just one example for chiefs of staff. But yes, do give some examples of how to lead relationally and not just rely on subject matter expertise.
Well, and I love I know you have a lot of causes on the call here or on the show. So, it's not just true for chief of staffs. It's true for every single leader. We can't know. What we were facing is an inversion of expertise. In with AI and all the technological changes that we're having going on, we can never know as much as our people do in their respective field. And so for them to come to us with the data and the information we need and we rely on, they need to trust us. And the only way they'll trust us is if we build meaningful and trusting relationships. And I have a personal example in the book. I went back into the military after having been out for 22 years to serve as a peacekeeper. So my military knowledge was I was outdated, almost totally outdated. But I had a command. I had a leadership position. So I knew that to be effective, I couldn't obviously lead by expertise. So I started to lead relationally, getting to know my team members on a personal level, literally taking them for lunch when we first started to work together, learn about their backgrounds, their hopes and concerns for the mission, and their expectations of me as their leader. And at the same time, let me be crystal clear, Emily, humility is no replacement for competence. I want to be very clear. Vulnerability, humility, all the things I talk in the book is no replacement for confidence. So we must, at the same time as we lead relationally, work our butts off to improve our technical expertise, knowing that we will never, by definition, actually have the skill level that some of our people do. So some of the things I advise leaders to do is to actually, leaning on Ed Shine's work, draw a relationship map. Grab a piece of paper, put a circle in the center, that's you, and then draw circles around you, all the people you're connected with. There's your family members, of course, friends, and then your peers, directs, your bosses, finance, ops, and then assess the level of relationship you have with each of these people on a scale of 1 to 5. And then ask yourself, how trusting is it? How meaningful is it? And then ask yourself, what should it be? and then identify the gaps, and then, book 1 or 2 relationship building meetings, 30-minute, Zooms or coffee meetings where we're planning on get to know the other person better. I did this in the UN. So I was promoted as Swiss senior early in my mission, and I was a low-ranking officer than everybody else on the leadership team, and I had to deliver some difficult news to the leadership. And the only reason why my feedback was heard is because up to this point, I made a real effort to get to know people, key people of the mission on a personal level. I literally pulled down the org chart of the UN mission and circled about 30 people who I knew I needed to build meaningful relationships with. So that's the relationship building meeting is one way to achieve this. There's a lot of other things, of course. What I like to do, every leadership position I have, is actually give everybody on the team 30 minutes where they share something they're passionate about. It could be anything. And the only requirement is you need to be passionate about it for 30 minutes. So you get to know each other on a meaningful way outside of work. And what happens? Trust improves, depth of relationship improves, engagement improves, and ultimately, bottom line results and business outcomes.
And you've said that in crisis situations or when change is happening, that having that foundation of relationships built up does wonders in those situations. So people are gelled together, people are cohesive, it's not mistrust, everything's kind of locked and loaded, and you can move quickly and adapt in a nimble way.
Well, yeah. So I'm Swiss, right? And so Swiss German, we have a saying in the Swiss Armed Forces, which says "in Krisen Köpfe kennen," which means literally translated in crisis, know the heads, like know the people. Because when the stuff hits the fan, personal relationships, knowing the right people you can call on to cut through red tape is always more important than detailed orders or procedures or flowcharts. And so, I talk about one particular situation in Kosovo where we had a life and death situation. And because our commander had built meaningful relationships with key people, we were able to solve the situation, but only, and the person survived and at the end did a full recovery, but only because he made the effort to build deep and meaningful relationships with key people, the ambassador, other contingent commanders. And if you think about what happened when the COVID crisis hit, right? So there is some research out there showing that organizations and teams that were well networked, everybody had knew somebody on every other any other team. So teams of team by McChrystal, right? You need to know one person on every team. They actually did better through the COVID crisis and actually improved in terms of their quality of relationships and business outcomes than those that were siloed. And it makes intuitive sense, right? So when the world shut down, I need to all of a sudden process all my payments online. I can call up the person who I, had coffee with last month in finance and talk to her about what I need to do here. So networked organizations where we have strong, meaningful relationships do significantly better through crisis. There's no question about that.
So in crisis, know the heads, meaning know the people that are around you and the people that you can call on to help. And I remember one of the examples, well, two of the examples, it was it Governor Patrick during the Boston Marathon bombing, who, this catastrophic event just happened, nothing ever like it before. People were scrambling. There was a huge need from a lot of different entities and parties. And so you talked about he didn't deep dive into the minutia, which a lot of leaders would have, like a panic, let me control everything and try to keep a handle on everything. Instead, he set the culture and he brought together the parties that needed to be connected. And he also made it clear, hey, here's this jurisdiction, here's that jurisdiction. Let's work together comprehensively. So I loved that example that you gave. But is that something to keep in mind? Like, hey, the governor had all these connections built up over time. And so when the worst of the worst happens, he was able to mobilize and lead at a high strategic level.
Absolutely. So he built strong relationships with all the different agencies and government organizations, but he didn't micromanage. You point out a really key trap, Emily, that we fall into often during crisis: the trap to micromanage in order to feel in control. And let's actually look at that for a second. Let's be honest. As leaders, we love to be asked for advice. We love to add value. Why? For better or worse, it's sort of intrinsic. We like to be needed. We like to, add value. But Governor Patrick walked into the command center each and every time, and instead of telling people what to do, he would ask, "How can I help?" So he understood that not, letting the people who were experts do their job and not getting into the minutiae, as you correctly pointed out, was the key to success. And the response to the Boston Marathon bombing actually has been credited as one of the most effective responses to disaster ever studied. And as you also said, Emily, that's leading with your eyes on, hands off is what I call that. So how can I help? Eyes on, hands off. It doesn't mean being passive. He was crystal clear around jurisdiction, as you said, and when there were conflicts in terms of overall purpose or resource scarcity, like that's when he stepped in and he allocated resources, and he stayed at the high level, but didn't go into the minutia. Another example, the sad war in Ukraine. Obviously, that's been going on for a long time now, but in the very early days, everybody, including military experts, were surprised, right? How well the Ukrainian armed forces did against overwhelming force. And to some extent now we're still surprised, although there's a lot of support, of course, from the West. But early on there was zero. Why? Because the Ukrainian armed forces had deep execution at the front lines, so that the infantry company commander could actually decide how, when, and if I engage the enemy. And to compare that to the Russian armed forces, where the smallest decisions have to travel all the way up to the generals, sometimes to the president, and then the decision comes down, and then it's way too late, right? So empowered execution at the front lines, staying out of your people's daily business, is absolutely the key to success in crisis. And in everyday leading our teams, I would put forward.
Yes, agree 100%. One more example I want to run through is you gave the example of Carla Overbeck, who was the captain of the US national soccer team. And she, by her own admission, was not the most talented soccer player. She said there are far better soccer players on this team, but she was captain and she was so well respected on that team. Can you just talk about what you outlined in that example?
Yeah, so this is actually a fascinating research piece. So, the best sports teams across all of time and all of sports, including the US women's soccer team, they don't have the most money, they don't have the best coaching staff, not the most talent. They all are led by humble captains, as you said, Carla Overbeck being one of them. Carla Overbeck would she only scored 7 goals in her entire international career, which even for a defender is low. She would always look for ways to pass the ball. I don't know. Are you a soccer player, Emily?
I was in high school, so nothing
Yeah.
near the national level.
Oh, as a European, I mean, I love soccer. I still watch a little bit. So, 7 goals in a long, illustrious international career is very low. And so she would always look for ways to pass the ball. And then off the field, she would often schlep her teammates back to their hotel room after like some especially grueling international flight. And she says, "I'm the captain, but I'm no better than anybody else. I'm certainly not a better soccer player." And, out of the public eye in training or practice, she pushed her teammates relentlessly. So her amazing work ethic, her passing humility on the field and backschlepping humility off the field allowed her to amass huge credit with her teammates, which she did spend when she needed to hold them accountable. So she was tender on people. She looked after her teammates so she could be tough on results. So that's something I talk about as well. Being tender on people gives me license to be tough on results. And as we all know, under Overbeck's leadership, the US women's soccer team was, unparalleled. Numerous World Cup victories and Olympic medals. So Overbeck is a wonderful example of a truly humble leader who stayed out the spotlight, didn't have superstar talent, absolutely not, but understood how to lead her team from behind as a highly effective, humble leader.
Yes, and so that one of the reasons the example caught my eye is because my cousin actually played on that team. So my cousin is Michelle Akers, and
Oh,
so I
really?
remember them speaking very, very highly of their captains and Carla and Joy Fawcett, who was also a defender. And yes, I mean Michelle was very, very talented. She had leadership skills as well, but some of those captains on that team really led the team both in their season and playing soccer and winning, but also with everything that was going on around them, which was publicity for the sport and the women's game and all that stuff. So those 99ers, the ones that won the 1999 World Cup were just kind of in this vortex of time. And so they were in it together. But yeah, I thought that was a fantastic example of you don't have to be the best soccer player in this sense to add a tremendous amount of value and be well respected by your team as a captain.
Yeah. Which, we come back to us in leadership positions in business, right? So I don't need to be the smartest person in the room. I don't need to have the most content expertise, but I need to know how to bring the best out of my team members. And so that as a whole, and I know this sounds maybe, a bit grandiose or maybe out there, but it really isn't. Like our job as leaders is to have our teams shine, like taking pride in my team member success. Another thing I talk about is developing our teams into leadership factories. So really thinking of how can each member of my team go to the next level. And by the way, our people will leave, they will, they just do. And so embracing that, and actually you hang on to your good team members longer, the more you challenge them, the more we stretch them. And then that's tough on results. And then tender on people is taking a keen interest in their career path.
And I think one of the things you mentioned in the book, which I found to be true in experience, is those folks would be so loyal to you. So they might stay on a little bit longer because you are giving them growth opportunities. And when someone can tell this person is investing in me, their time and money and training, and they're just taking me aside and showing me different things, that will engender loyalty. Eventually they will leave, but you never know if you're going to reconnect down the line or, that's just more people will want to come to your team if they see, oh, if I'm on Emily's team, she really takes care of her people and she gives them credit for things and she allows them to progress in their career. You're going to be, I think you call it a leadership magnet or a talent magnet. People
Exactly.
will want to come to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right on. So, they will leave eventually, but they will hang around longer because let's face it, people don't leave bad jobs. They leave, excuse my French, shitty bosses, probably shouldn't say this on your podcast, and dysfunctional teams, right? So that's what they leave. And, they might, or they hang around longer. And also boomerang employees. There's so many people who try the startup world or go to a different organization. The grass is always greener. And then they realize, oh, the grass isn't actually greener. And they might come back. So if I've, treated my people well, I've mentored them, as you said, and I coached them, they're much more likely to actually come back home, so to speak.
One of the great things you mentioned in the book is this concept of feed forward. So instead of feedback, which we're all familiar with, it's feed forward. So this is the notion of instead of looking at the past and judging things as good or bad, right or wrong, we're future oriented. We're, hey, how can I get better? And one of the things that you recommend for leaders is to ask for feedback in the lens of feeding it forward. So I think one example I remember in the book was asking for feedback and instead of just asking for traditional, how did that go? You said, I want to become a better listener. So, Barbara, can you give me some specific examples or suggestions of how I can become a better listener going forward? And that allowed Barbara in this situation to say, hey, my suggestion going forward is you put down your cell phone, you make eye contact, you paraphrase things that you've heard said. And it just seemed like a good framework to collect feedback on. So, can you talk a little bit about that concept and how to apply it as a leader?
Absolutely. And, to be clear, that's borrowed from Marshall Goldsmith. So Marshall Goldsmith really coined the phrase feed forward, which is just a fancy way of saying suggestions for the future. But you're absolutely right. So feedback is valuable. Do we like giving it? Not so much. Do we like receiving it? Probably even less, but it's still valuable because why do we look back? We look back to learn. But there's nothing I can do about the past, literally nothing. But feed forward, as you say, suggestions for the future. You're not judging me. I'm not asking my people to judge me when I ask for suggestions going forward. And so I do this often in team retreats. I have everybody pick something that they want to work on. You just said listener or a better delegator. And then I have every participant walk around the room and talk to at least 3 people and ask for feed forward. Give me suggestions on how I can become a better listener. And, I do this rapid fire, like no context, no discussion, just give me suggestions as you just did with listening and thank you and move on. And it's such a positive experience for us to get suggestions on our goal. And so that's the feed forward. Both are valuable. The feedback, we look back to learn, and feed forward suggestions for the future. And one on the feedback piece, I want to be very clear. Yes, it is valuable, and sometimes it's difficult for us to have our people feel comfortable to give us feedback. So I advocate on a regular basis that during my one-on-one at the end, I ask my team members these simple 2 questions. What do you see me do well as your manager? What works, and what can I improve as your manager? And so that can be challenging, especially when we first start out, for people to feel comfortable to give us feedback. So one little trick I have is that you actually identify, much like you did before, Emily, a goal of your own. So you could say, look, I'm working on XYZ, and I'm working on becoming a better listener. Can you give me some feedback on how I've been doing the last week? And so then you invite your team members to give you feedback on something you already identified that you're working on, so something that you've already said. So it's much safer for your team members to then give you feedback versus just keeping it open-ended.
And I think throughout the book, you have this theme of, you have to go first. So if you're going to share something that you're working on, is you talk about the vulnerability loop where you share something a little vulnerable and then you just let that sit with the team. And the natural human response is to reciprocate. So people will share a little bit like, oh, well, you did that. Like, let me tell you about what I did. And it just creates this culture where we share and we're not judging each other. One of the really cool things I like about Feed Forward is it it helps the person who is giving feedback, who giving, uh, suggestions, they have to be specific. So it can't just be like, "Oh, yeah, like, I'd like you to improve your listening skills." Well, okay, you need like, specifically how? And so it makes them instead of just saying, "Oh, I wish he would listen better. Geez, he needs to be a better listener." Well, now you're having a chance to give specific examples. "Oh, well, I guess it would be putting down your phone or giving us your full attention or making eye contact." So I think it's a good mechanism to get specific feedback as well.
Well, and you're so right, Emily. And what's powerful about this is, all of a sudden, we're all very good, as humans, to sort of generalize feedback and, oh, she just doesn't listen, or he just can't delegate, whatever. And then we ask for feed forward. Then we sort of, you're on the hook. Like now you need to actually deliver a little bit. So versus just, sort of blanket statement criticizing. So you're exactly right. That's an important part of feed forward. You sort of make the other person almost part of your journey. Like, they then buy in to some extent because they need to really give their own suggestions on how to get better. That's a really important point.
Yes. And I love you said in the book, one of the most important phrases a leader can learn is, I screwed that up. So being able to say, look, I screwed that one up, guys. Team.
Well, yeah. So I have an example. During my peacekeeping mission 2 years ago in the Middle East, our commanding officer opened an after action review exactly with these words, like, I screwed that up, and here is what I'm learning from it, and here is what I can do better going forward. So quick side note, I like to talk about vulnerability in 3 acts. So the first act is, that's me. The second act is what I'm sharing, like something I screwed up or an insecurity. And the third act is what I'm going to do about it. And so in 3 acts. And so then, because she went first during the after action review, it made it safe for all of us, her directs, to do the same and mirror her vulnerability of saying, I screwed that up. And this particular after action actually led to much better operations on the ground, all because she went first. And so that's a really key point. The best teams the best and most effective teams understand that being vulnerable together is the only way that the team can become invulnerable, even in the military. I mean, I coach special operators from time to time when they get out of the service into the civilian life, and the level of bond that special operators have, and we know this sort of from reading the books and watching the movies, you know, they tell each other they love each other all the time. It's deep emotional bonds. They're deeply vulnerable together. So the best teams truly understand that being vulnerable together is the only way that the team can become invulnerable.
And one of the kind of a side tangent on that is somewhere in the book you mentioned the best activities for team building are cooking and eating together. And so you see a lot of like military and doctors, they eat together. So I was just curious where did that come from or how did that manifest itself in your military experience?
Yeah, so this is the idea that when we experientially learn together, and learning by definition is uncomfortable because we're trying new things, right? So that's an incredibly powerful way to build a team. So yes, there is actually research done in hospitals where surgery teams that eat together at the same table versus doctors with doctors, nurses with nurses, technicians with
Oh,
technicians actually do better in the operating theater. And so, that's simply sharing a meal. That's, one could argue not exactly experiential learning together, but that's where it starts. And then, I talk about in a book that when I was in my peacekeeping training, we underwent numerous hostage training situations, and not just
yes,
situations.
you did.
Yeah, exactly. So intense stuff. And so, and really unpleasant and very intense exercises. And without exception, whoever I was going through this exercise with, we came out stronger in terms of trust, level of relationship, and the ability to rely on each other because we experientially learned together. And, we were in situations where, you know, all of us at times were helpless. We didn't know what to do. So we had to rely on whoever was in the position to take action, regardless of rank or position. So there is a real, and I mean, in the corporate setting, Taco Bell, for example, does this brilliantly. Every corporate employee has to work in their restaurants for a week as part of their onboarding, including the CEO. And the CEO says, I'm a better leader because of it. It tears down hierarchies. It makes it safe for them, for frontline people who work in the restaurants as for their full-time jobs to actually speak up to corporate with issues they have. So this notion of, now the Starbucks CEO does that as well. He works as a barista and whatnot. So this notion of getting out of our day to day and experiential learning together can really deepen the bond in a team.
I think that's a good point because you've said over and over again in your book, tearing down hierarchy requires doing non-hierarchical things. So, like cooking or just learning a new activity or doing it together where everyone's equal. No one's the boss or no one's better at this. It's all learning together. So I think that's something a great point or a takeaway for the listener if they're thinking, "Oh, how do we maybe plan an offsite or maybe do a team building?" Think about it through that lens. And yes, you did mention. I remember at one rough situation you were in. You got slammed into the back of a van. You had the hood over your head and everything like that. You got your hands tied and feet tied, and you were saying, I was claustrophobic. I couldn't breathe. At one point, you were trying to make space between your mouth and the hood over your head with your tongue to try to get a little bit of space. And in that, you were trying to sense if your teammates were around, which you were trained to do. And even just like if you touch them with your elbow or touch them with your knee, just some sort of contact, it was saying, hey, we're in this together. And so just making those connection points with your team members and points of crisis when you have foundation built up, when you've done things in a non-hierarchical sense, and then you have to come together in these crisis points, you have those connection points. So, oof, trying stuff, trying stuff.
Well, yeah. No, I mean, and we don't. I think I joke in the book about that. We don't have to take our people hostage. HR would probably not approve. But there is. I can't now honestly remember who wrote about that. But there were plenty of leaders when the COVID crisis first hit who did this at the start of every meeting. They did a quick personal check-in, so the equivalent of the physical nudge, right, in the car, and it's probably difficult to relate to this, that level of comfort you feel when you're tied down and stripped down and your head is backed and everything. That little nudge from a friendly person can make a huge difference. And so a little nudge when, we're going through an acquisition maybe or another crisis, like, let's do 30 seconds. How are we doing personally? What's the most challenging thing I'm facing personally, and what's giving me joy right now? So these quick personal check-ins can have incredible power for our people, no question.
And last thing I want to touch on is the final chapter in the book is about building a fearless culture. And you open that chapter with a cool study. It was, I think, in 2010 about what makes an outstanding team. And it involves business school students, it involves kindergartners and marshmallows. So,
Right.
can you just do a quick recap of the findings of that study and what can it tell us about building a fearless culture?
So that's there's actually numerous experiments that were made. So the competition is this: you have some 20 pieces of uncooked spaghetti, and many of the listeners probably done this exercise as part of a team building event. Some scotch tape and string and the marshmallow. You have 18 minutes in a team, and you have to build the highest structure, or whoever builds the highest structure wins, and the marshmallow has to be on top of the end. At the end, that's the only rule. And so, there were MBAs, bunch of Harvard MBAs and kindergartners. And who wins? Surprise. The kindergartners win consistently, and they beat Harvard MBA or MBAs by, I think, on average 16 inches, lawyers by 11, and CEOs by 6 consistently. Why? They don't win because they have better skills or more talent. They win because they're fearless, because they have psychological safety. So they don't, care about stepping on each other's toes. Business school students, when they do their exercise, they're distracted with managing their ego and status. Who should be in charge? What will they think? Will I look stupid? Instead of experimenting and starting to build immediately, they're distracted with managing their own ego and status. They don't have psychological safety. And so it's a fun little example of how powerful psychological safety can be. And so then, kindergartners don't really care what everybody else thinks. So they don't need to be trained in psychological safety. But then as we grow up, we get conditioned. Don't say anything. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't rock the boat, like all that stuff, which makes it hard to speak up. So then we need to train ourselves to provide as leaders a psychologically safe culture. And that's, leaning on Amy Edmondson's work, of course, out of Harvard, the queen of psychological safety. And so that's the third leg of the stool I talked earlier, is this notion of making it safe for all of our team members to speak up with questions, concerns, doubts, without fear of being shamed or worse, risking their career. And so I have a little framework in there, which you can take your teams through to shift your culture towards a culture of psychological safety.
And the thing that I took out of that study is the kindergartners just started trying stuff. Like it tried and failed. They didn't care what people thought, but they just tried, and they were hands on, tactically doing stuff. And to me, as a business leader, I thought, oh, okay, it's creating an environment of, yes, you're not scared of being judged, but also of innovation.
Yeah.
So if you can create that environment where people come up with ideas and try stuff, you are going to get literally further ahead and farther ahead in that study. So the thing goes higher. But to me, that's a kind of a one for one takeaway. And okay, if you can create an environment as a leader, don't deep dive into the weeds and control the minutia, but enhance that environment in such a way people are willing to jump in, not care about being judged, and come up with new ideas. And let me try it. This might be stupid, but let me try it. I think that's a great place for cultures and teams to be in.
I think you're exactly right. So this is a really important point you're making. Let's ask ourselves, like, how can I create experiments in our own business? Small experiments. If they fail, it's fine. Like, we're not doing this with a major client or a major account. But how? And we can do this. You and I can do this in our respective small businesses. Emily, maybe I do something. Search engine optimization. I try something. I do an experiment, and so to really as you said, take the lessons from the kindergartners and design thoughtful, or have our people come up with thoughtfully designed experiments and stuff we can try out, and then and learn to fail too. And there's different failures. That's the intelligent failure then, which we need to celebrate because we're learning something. So I think you make an excellent point there.
Beautiful. Well, Urs, there's so much more in your book that I wanted to go into, but we're coming up at time. So just for the listener, I would highly recommend Radical Humility, Be a Badass Leader and a Good Human. Also, it's a beautiful book. So, I mean, this is a fully color printed book. There's graphs and charts all throughout. It's just a beautiful book. So I don't know if we'll show this up in case for people can look at YouTube, but just a beautiful book. So I would highly recommend this one to our listener. And Urs, you're a keynote speaker. You're a coach. Tell people what you're up to, and if they wanted to learn more or reach out to you, where is the best spot for them to do that?
Absolutely, yes. So on the web, my website, urskoenig.com, for my keynote speaking, workshops, a bit of coaching. I don't do that much coaching anymore. And then LinkedIn is probably the platform I'm most active on. So get in touch. I'd love to hear what you think about the book, and I'd love to come in and help the organization to lead with radical humility.
Beautiful. We'll have those links in the show notes. And Urs, thank you once again for being on. It was a pleasure to have you. And please keep in touch, and you're welcome back on the show anytime.
Thanks so much, Emily. I had a lot of fun.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.